I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to this month's episode of Masters of Controlled Chaos. And this month, we're going to be looking at an interesting director, a director that I would say is underrated, a director that I didn't really have on my radar until recently, but I'm very impressed by his filmography, and unfortunately didn't realize it until he had passed away. I'm talking about none other than the amazing Jonathan Demme. So, if you're new to the series, what I do every single month, aside from my weekly Forgotten Oscar film series, is I look at a director. I sort of do a huge breakdown, deep dive, long video on a director and his filmography. It's changed over, the series has changed over the years, but right now this iteration is I look at the central idea as to what makes them great. I also look at 3 films I think really define their career and talk about how that fits into their overall career trajectory. But Jonathan Demme, he's always sort of been an elusive figure to me. He's someone who I haven't really completely understood as a filmmaker until a couple things started to happen. First, one of my favorite podcasts, Blank Check with Griffin and David, they do this sort of contest, I guess you kind of say, a fan interaction event where they do a March Madness bracket of the director they're going to choose. The podcast is about covering directors' filmography, and out of multiple directors, famous people like Paul Thomas Anderson, Jonathan Demme ended up winning out of all those people. So that was an interesting sort of pick. I didn't realize there was so much interesting fans for them, but I decided that, okay, that's maybe something I could do because I do like watching their films for their podcasts. And then another aspect was that I watched Vox Lux recently and noticed that was dedicated to Jonathan Demme. So I thought, okay, then I remembered, oh right, If Beale Street Could Talk was dedicated to Jonathan Demme, and so was Suspiria, the most recent one, and so was Phantom Thread, and Paul Thomas Anderson is a huge Jonathan Demme fan. He sort of mentored him, and he's one of his favorite filmmakers. And a lot of my sort of film-going experience has always been trying to find filmmakers that I like, that are sort of modern and contemporary and critically acclaimed, and then finding the filmmakers that those people respect and understand those films, and that's the way I've always sort of done my film-going experience and understanding in terms of history. So I thought that these modern great filmmakers are talking about this same guy, so I might as well sort of understand and look into him, because of course I knew about his films while he was alive. Silence of the Lambs is sort of a classic film. Of course, Philadelphia is well recommended, but for me, he wasn't necessarily of the likes of some of these really, you would think, influential guys, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, that are, of the same age as Jonathan Demme. Those guys are, of course, sort of the symbolic sort of auteurs, the very few first people that I covered on this episode, on this sort of series, excuse me. But why does it take me so long to get to Jonathan Demme? Well, in a lot of these episodes, I like to have sort of thematic elements that I can really point out. And Jonathan Demme, I always thought, was a journeyman director, a director who sort of worked from project to project, that sort of was just happy to get a job and direct making movies. And he tried to do his best, but he sort of tried to serve the material. And that's different than something like Stanley Kubrick, which has a distinct visual style throughout all of his films, even though he worked in different genres. But I was wrong. As I started to understand and go through his filmography, I really understood sort of the visual flares, and I could understand within a few minutes, actually, if this was a Jonathan Demme film. At least I think so, because of certain elements that he brings. Really, first, I guess you would sort of break his filmography into his Hollywood movies, which really, I guess it was his Corman movies, which started off that sort of transition, Caged Heat, Crazy Mama, Handle with Care, and then sort of transition into more Hollywood movies that are sort of comedy-based and manic and sort of frantic, I guess you would say, which would be Married to the Mob and Something Wild. And then his other sort of half of his Hollywood career, very much dramatic focused, in something like Silence of the Lambs or Philadelphia or Rachel Getting Married. But then, even something like Manchurian Candidate, which is still a thriller, is very much sort of the serious drama aspect, and it's very much different than something to like a comedy, like I would say Married to the Mob is. And then, his other sort of half of his filmography is his documentaries, whether they be concert films and Stop Making Sense and Justin Timberlake and the Tennessee Kids, or his other sort of documentary films like Cousin Bobby or The Agronomist or I'm Carolyn Parker, which very much look at sort of these singular, ordinary people, humanist tales. And that's sort of a linking element that I think you would be able to understand is actually his characters, how he treats them, and how much respect, empathy, and humanity he ultimately gives his characters. He loves his character deeply, and he wants you to sympathize and empathize with them. That's sort of a linking through, whether it be, sort of his documentaries that focus on very much ordinary people. All of his films, always focus on sort of the ordinary person or just a regular person. I would say, aside from something like The Last Embrace, always focus on a regular person doing sort of extraordinary things or being put in an extraordinary event. Even in something like Silence of the Lambs, it's sort of very unlikely that a police would ever work and try to find down a serial killer just because there are such few of them, but Clarice definitely realizes she has to step up, that she's sort of out of her element in one sense that she's not living up almost to her own expectations. In Philadelphia, this is sort of a regular sort of lawyer, but he's going through a monumental event, both of them really. Melvin and Howard's sort of a great example of just sort of a regular person trying to understand sort of this fame that's about to sort of hit him because he says he was in Howard Hughes' will, but we really see all sort of, it's not about that because it's about his tale and his marital problems and sort of his journey as a regular person, and that's what Demme, I think, is most focused with, and he does that quite often to demonstrate the humanist tales. His really only distinct visual flair, I guess you would say, is his close-up. The effect is not sort of singular, which I think he appreciates, and I think adds to his sort of aspect of the film, because in Beloved, which is very much kind of a horror, gothic horror movie, where the characters are professing their love, but also professing their fear, and in something like Silence of the Lambs, the fear on Clarice and her uneasiness and her in her unassuredness. You can see that through sort of Hannibal's incredible presence and demeaning nature. You also notice that in something like a Manchurian Candidate, he has an anxiety-ridden character because of the situation that he's in, and sort of his unassuredness, so much to Clarice that we understand and really see the sort of the cracks in his face, and but we do that multiple times. Not through dialogue scenes in that film in particular, but very much going through just that signature close-up. Now, he also really is interested in his humanist characters because sometimes he'll have an energy. He has his energy in terms of his fast, rapid editing and his crime aspects in something like Married to the Mob or something wild, which is very much Martin Scorsese-esque. But he still has focused very much more on making sure you sympathize and empathize with the characters. Where Martin Scorsese, you're really not interested maybe in making you empathize with Travis Bickle. Still, they'll understand, because ultimately movies are sort of a tool for us to understand and really get where a person's coming from, but less so on a sort of demented side, but more of a trying to understand their complexities. Melvin and Howard is a great example of this, where the character of Melvin really, the sort of phenomenon he's known for happens in the last sort of 15 minutes, and then in the beginning sort of 20 minutes with Howard, really doesn't, we don't really understand the consequences. So really for the most of the film, it's about his familial sort of troubles, and his troubles with his wife and his daughter, and trying to connect with them, and his succeedings and his failures as sort of just an everyday person. And something like Rachel Getting Married is a great example too, because that's a movie that's such a strong familial tragedy in the center of it, yet oftentimes never casts judgment against Rachel, and understands that she was a teenager, or she has obviously drug problems, and tries to understand with certain techniques, sure, but tries to understand less so with the close-up, but still make sure you understand all the different sides to her and why she does the things she does. And that's why I think maybe I've always connected to a journeyman director, because he does concert films, which are sort of different than sort of your mainstream classic Hollywood feature films. He does something like Rachel Getting Married, which is a complete distinction from his style, which is sort of Document 95 aspect, documentary-esque. So in a lot of ways, he explores different styles and different cinematography techniques throughout his films, but that feel right. But he always sort of, his visual flair, he goes to the close-up because it can work in different genres, and also sort of that central respect and that he gives to all of his characters, including, a lot of times he, instead of making the character say that they're going through a life-changing moment, he'll just show it to you. And often, a lot of times movies will try to express the character's feelings through dialogue, like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm feeling this. This is amazing. I can't believe this is such an extraordinary experience. Instead, Demme allows you to understand that even though they get caught up in all the extraordinary aspect, that that's just an ordinary person, and a lot of times allows us a chance for the characters to breathe and understand it and reflect and look, oh hey, this is a unique experience, this is something that's going to be mine and something that I'm going to cherish, and we understand that just by sort of through looks, and that's why he gets such great performances, because there's always such these great complex characters to his films. So talking about now my first film, which is Stop Making Sense. So, Stop Making Sense, this is a film that I actually really enjoyed, and this is arguably the greatest concert film of all time, but really, the central question I was trying to ask myself, if you don't know, based on a concert that was filmed by the Talking Heads in 1982, released in 1984, so I'm not exactly sure when, filmed sort of interspersed with 4 different concerts, but still a film that is often considered by myself and by many other people as the greatest concert film of all time. But I was still questioning to myself why, because the concert film is not a genre that I'm completely familiar with. It's not something like a comedy or drama, which I can sort of talk about because I've seen millions, as have you, watching at home. But I think that I was trying to understand why this film was better than something like Justin Bieber's Never Say Never, or other concert films that maybe didn't have the sort of energy in the sense that this one did have. And of course, there are multiple different reasons as to why. But really, there's one thing sort of that I came across to, which is, or not one thing, there's multiple reasons, but one of the things I came across to are little sort of visual tricks that I think add to the overall experience. One being that they never cut back to the audience. There's always often wides, but never really sort of this cheap trick that you see in many other concert films that sort of try to create a sense of energy or try to understand that this is a concert and this is live. Demme really tries to focus on making sure you're in the moment, that you're understanding the concert, and that you're present with the filmmakers at the time, and that you're really trying to absorb everything that's sort of going on. There's also clearly very much a concert film and not a film concert. Everyone has crappy cell phone video footage of their concerts that you see at every film, but at every concert. But that's not a film. This is a film that has different camera movements, that gets you angles that you wouldn't be able to get. Gets very much in close with the actors. Has sort of wides as well. So that helps, of course, the sort of clear choreography that is going on with the camera and the actor and the performers and the band, of course. Also, there's a real sense that he treats it like musicals of sort of the 30s and 40s, where those movies would often just cut to a wide and let the performers dance, and you see the entire body of Gene Kelly or Fred Astaire and really understand their brilliance. Similar to this, Demme will just show wides of David Byrne dancing, or sometimes he'll have like 1-2 minute takes that are technically long takes, I guess, that really actually create energy, not by cutting rapidly and try to create a false sense of energy. He lets you almost do what you do in a normal concert, which is self-edit, which is look at a performer for 2 minutes and then start looking at David Byrne and then look at someone else, or if there's a guitar riff, you look at that guy. But oftentimes just lingering on these shots allow you to sort of understand, make you feel like you're actually a member of the band on the stage, which is really crucial. Another element too is that it actually has a narrative. This is a film that still has kind of a narrative in more of an abstract way, but we start off with David Byrne. He's by himself. This choice of the songs start off as sort of hopeful and lost and confusing, and sort of wondering to sort of more hopeful and optimistic and maybe even melancholy near the end. Plus it starts off with David Byrne just himself, and then as each song progresses, each member of the band sort of comes up on the stage. It's very much theatrical. As we hear sort of the sound gets a little bit more fuller, we have background dancers, and then even once we have everybody up on the stage, there's still these elements that, at least visual elements, that sort of add and keep your interest, whether it be the lamp and the dance with that, or it's the big suits near the end. All these different sort of crazy ramping, escalating sort of moments and increasing interest and ultimately excitement and energy. All these aspects aspects that Demme understands. He's able not to things like not cut to the audience, to linger on the audience, linger on the band, and just let them play and let them perform and almost try to get out of the way, I think is the best thing he could do. And this is why this is of the likes of some of his Neil Young movies, or take the Last Waltz. It's one of those movies that are very monumental, and a movie that it's almost impossible not to dance to. I challenge you to that. Hey, now moving into my next movie, Married to the Mob. This is the peak of his sort of manic, crazy, frantic career. Very much in his early career with doing his Roger Corman movies, Cage Tea, Crazy Mama, Handle with Care, all really fun, interesting films, but they're very much, especially the first two, crime movies with guns and action, and the characters are very heightened, that they're not really believability, which is different from this movie. Even though this film is a movie that has all these manic craziness and like I said, energy to it, it still has a solid core to it. But speaking on that energy, I've mentioned that a couple times, but there's not really a defining characteristic. I talked about more in depth in the Spike Lee episode, but with this episode, he very much has great sense of energy through constant, pretty quick, upbeat editing. His use of music oftentimes is upbeat and very 80s in that sense. The costume designer, Colleen Atwood, legendary costume designer, must have had a blast with this because there's such bright, colorful characters. Of course, they have to go to Miami because it's an 80s movie. But those are all sort of the exterior things that any sort of 80s crime movie comedy could have done. But really, there's these sort of great over-the-top performances that Demme does, where it's comedic, but it's also tragic and sad elements. There's really a lot of layers to this movie. There's also sort of these Sam Raimi-esque camera movements with these incredible push-ins, with these pans. Of course, he does use the Demme close-up, but he tries to make the camera almost a part of the action and feel a part of this world. But then that sort of course, is contrasted with sort of the difference of Michelle Pfeiffer's character, who plays this woman whose husband just died, and her husband's a mobster, and she wants to get out of this life. So that's hard enough alone, right? She's trying to live that sort of interesting life of getting away from this life and restart her own life, which is sort of a noble pursuit on its own, and that's hard on its own, and trying to find a romance and trying to find a new job and even just a haircut she likes, and really find something that's her own. And that's already hard enough, but then of course the comedy comes from still being connected to the mob and still having those ties. It's really a great balance between the two, and the general the sort of comedy that's of course there, but also there's a real sort of solid beating heart of a woman that's just trying to understand her place in the world and try to do something that's not stolen and fallen off a truck. It's something that's her own, and a place that's her own, and something that she can sort of be aspirational to her child in a lot of ways. And I think Michelle Pfeiffer understands that, and Demme brings that humanist tale to this sort of general crime caper story. And then, of course, the final film I want to talk about is the legendary Oscar-winning Silence of the Lambs. What is there to say more about Silence of the Lambs aside from, it's maybe one of the greatest films of all time, par maybe some gender politics, especially maybe surrounding Buffalo Bill. But in terms of the thriller genre, it's definitely up there of the likes of great filmmakers like Alfred Hitchcock. But I actually think it's better than something like a Hitchcock movie because it's allows, I think Hitchcock movies sometimes, the performances, while good, sometimes are distant and cold and not necessarily relatable. Now that's something, I think that really works for someone like David Fincher's aspect, who looks at sort of these cold, calculating characters and trying to understand the humanity behind them that is sort of briefly shown, but that's sort of what you linger onto in those movies. I think this one, the humanity's the center and the forefront of it, because of course this is from Jonathan Demme. He's a humanist kind of police procedural, but it's more than just a police procedural, because of course it won the big 5 Oscars: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, lead for both, and then Best Writing, which only a few other films have done. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, It Happened One Night. But this is a film where Demme isn't interested in breaking genre conventions. He's very much interested in staying in these genre conventions and bringing his sensibility to them. He's not someone like a Stanley Kubrick who wants to make a completely different movie but still say it's in the genre. He's very much interested in keeping that genre but adding another layer to it, which is very interesting. Like I said, Married to the Mob, of course, a great crime comedy, but he adds this really humanist layer about a woman trying to find her independence. And in this film, very much a police procedural, but still, once again, about a woman in sort of a man's world in sort of the police and trying to succeed on these sort of maybe unrealistic expectations she puts on herself, and a woman's struggle with her own perfectionism, I would say. So, you know, there's always a little bit more. You know, there's always been so much said about Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter, but I really want to talk about Jodie Foster as Clarice. There's so many times where we understand her character, not through dialogue sequences, but just how Demme frames the sequences and shoots the movie. Oftentimes she's standing in an elevator, and we see these two giant guys beside her, diminishing her in her sort of stature. Oftentimes there's these low-angle shots of these men or people just sort of completely ignoring Clarice. And Clarice is not necessarily a feminist who is interested in speaking out against sort of the injustice. She's very much a character who is going to do her job and do it well and gain the respect of her coworkers that way, which is, of course, equally as admirable, I would say. Even more admirable because, in a lot of ways, she's, you know, actions speak louder than words in that sense. But really, it's not only she's trying to fit in this police world, she's also trying to be doing an incredibly hard case. And there's all these sort of expectations that she unfairly, I guess you would say, maybe puts upon herself, where she knows that, you know, she has to be great because she's one of the few women, and then she messes up, that's bad. And, you know, she's trying to be this sort of steely person against one of the great foes of Hannibal Lecter, but she does crack and she does make mistakes, and she's a human character. She's not just this more stereotypical one cold woman cop that really acts like a man. She's a character that's really written as a woman and uses her femininity as a strength in a lot of ways, which I appreciate, which you don't see a lot of times in female characters. I think Demme's smart in a lot of ways just to step back and capture her performance and use small techniques like that close-up to really emphasize her performance and really create amazing moments out of it. Of course, I can talk about the amazing set pieces, whether it's Hannibal Lecter's cage sequence or the ending in Buffalo Bill's house. There's so many little redirects and reworks that are so much fun and interesting, and I think that if you're looking for a fun police procedural, this will work for you. But if you're seeing, say if you want something a little bit more out of it, it is there. You know, it has a criterion release for Pete's sake. I mean, it is one of those fantastic films, and I think one of the greatest movies maybe of all time. That's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Comment below, let me know your favorite Jonathan Demme film. That's about it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, stay tuned.